Hello everybody, you're very welcome to join us. This is a program that concerns the 500 plus community school, and we're working our way through the New Testament. We're actually looking now at the general epistles, and particularly today we want to focus on the Epistle of James. Now the lecture will be given, but you must download the notes. This is a very complex letter. It needs careful handling, and you need the notes to really get the full picture of what we can find here in this particular epistle. So please make sure that you take time to download the notes and then study it for the month until the next one, DV, comes along. Of the 27 books in the New Testament, 21 are epistles, and 13 of these epistles have the name Paul as the author. Hebrews is anonymous, although many have also ascribed that epistle to the Apostle Paul. The rest of the epistles are known as general or Catholic or universal epistles, in spite of the fact that some have what appears to be a local destination. Now, we looked at Hebrews. We want to go on to consider the Epistle of James. There are 4 questions I want to ask as we look at this particular book today. First of all, who wrote James? Then we could say, when was it written? And thirdly, what can we say about its first readers? And finally, why was it written? What's its value? What's its purpose? And as I've said to you already, you'll find full coverage in the notes of all those particular questions. And I want to touch upon each one of them just now briefly here in this video. First of all, we are asking the question, who wrote James? Now, of course, we're going to say here that it was written by James, the Lord's brother. That's what we're going to say. It's amazing, when you look at James chapter 1 and verse 1, James, who we're claiming is the Lord's brother, he writes, James, a bondservant, a bondslave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. He presents himself simply as a bondslave of Jesus Christ. But, before the 16th century, we have the acceptance of that traditional position. That's before the 16th century. That is, that it was written by James, the Lord's brother. He was the author. You can go back earlier to Origen in the 3rd century. He's working in the East. You've got it. He's the one who speaks about the book by James, and it was spoken of by him and established in the Western Church. By the end of the 4th century, then, we can see Origen was in the East. In the Western Church, by the end of the 4th century, we have Jerome, Augustine, we have the councils of Rome and Carthage. So you've got in the East, you've got Origen, and then in the 4th century, you've got the West, the others that I've mentioned to you. You observe from that probably that clear attestation is late. It's not as early as some of the other letters in the New Testament, but there are allusions to it, echoes. They're found as early as 1 Clement. They're found in the Shepherd of Hermas, or going back there to 95 to 96 in the Christian era, and also in 140 to 154 when we talk about the epistle or the Shepherd of Hermas. So there are early attestations to the book as well. But I mentioned the 16th century, and that's important. I want to explain what that's all about. Luther actually claimed that the author was another James. He considered that the book didn't belong to the chief books of the New Testament, the proper books. Compared to them, he could say it's simply an epistle of straw, since it has in it no quality of gospel. Now, sadly, he was mistaken there, really, because we know the reason why he was concerned about this, because he was so concerned to emphasize justification by faith. And among other things, he felt that James seems to be emphasizing that we're justified by works and not by faith only. And we're going to see that really James is complementary, not contradictory to the teaching of Paul. That's the important thing to discover. But Luther was not willing to see it in that light at that time. So he accused James of teaching justification by works, in contradiction to Paul, not preaching Christ or preaching the law, just a generalized faith in God. And the book was disorganized and very Jewish. Now, we're going to see there are reasons for all of that. And that doesn't mean that we have to give up that this book was written by James, the Lord's brother, at all, as we'll see as we go through the lecture here today. So that's the 16th century when you have this blip with Luther and his view of James. The 19th century saw the rise of modern criticism, and then you've got someone like De Wet who challenged the traditional authorship, especially on the ground of its language. He considered it difficult to attribute the fluent Greek that's here. Could you really attribute that to James, the Lord's brother? And so, of course, others have argued, and we maintain this very, very clearly, that the followers of Jesus were not just unlearned and ignorant men, and we're going to see that as we go through today. But this is the position that was taken with the rise of modern criticism. 4 positions actually can be recognized among modern scholars. First of all, there was the view that James was dated later than the lifetime of James, the Lord's brother, usually in the last quarter of the 1st century or early in the 2nd century. So a pseudonymous author has to be responsible, not James, the Lord's brother. And support for that position of it being a pseudonymous writing was the fact that it was attested late, as we saw earlier. It's good Greek, it's Hellenistic rather than Jewish thought, and its conflict, as they considered, with some form of Paulism. So there was said to be a contradiction between Paul's justification by faith and what James wrote about justification what involved works. But there's not that contradiction as we stress here. But there were those that dated it later. That's the first position that was taken. A pseudonymous author was responsible. And then others held that the epistle originates in material coming from James. It's coming from James now, either in oral or written form, but it's been reworked, it's been added to. And you have different scholars in the past, commentators who took that position, like Burkitt and Knox. And even more recently, we might mention Martin as well, one of the commentaries that's a modern commentary also. The scholars seem impressed by arguments concerning the Hellenistic elements alongside a very Jewish Christian origin of much of the material. So they take this position that it's material coming from James, either in oral or written form that's been reworked. And then the third position was that it was just a Jewish work. We have Spitta in 1896 and 1895, Messabaeu. These men held that independently that this work was actually, we could say, a pre-Christian Jewish work, taken over into Christianity, and that was done by the simple addition of 2 interpolations of the name of Christ, and those interpolations are found in 1:1 and in 2:1. So those are the positions that were adopted. And then finally, there was the traditional position that the work was by James, the Lord's brother. It's usually claimed that the author of the epistle, who with no ceremony lays claim to authority, can't be by an unknown teacher. I mean, Davis has written, "What teacher of so little significance that he is now unknown could take it upon himself to address such a significant portion of the church, that is, the 12 tribes, let alone in such witty tones?" No, it can't be. It can't be by someone who is an unknown teacher. The authority is here, and that's pointing to James, the Lord's brother. The simplicity of the greeting is understood to be against this theory of pseudonymity. You don't have any titles here like James, brother of the Lord, or James the elder, or the apostle of Christ. Those are the type of titles that you would need in a pseudonymous work. And all those are missing here. Just a bondslave, as I pointed out, of the Lord Jesus Christ. The men in the New Testament called James, what can we say about them? Well, you've got, of course, James, the son of Zebedee. But he died too early and left no literary works at all. We're talking about Acts 12 here. James and John, who were sons of Zebedee. In Acts chapter 12. So you're looking at before 44 Christian era. And then you've got James, the son of Alphaeus. He's one of the 12, but he's still an unknown teacher. And there's no kind of authority here that he could have. And that authority is coming out in this letter. And then we have, of course, the arguments for James, the Lord's brother. What can we say about that position, taking that traditional position that it's by James, the Lord's brother? Well, his Jewish background is there. He's drawn much from the Old Testament. There may only be 5 direct quotations, but indirect allusions are many. They're found right throughout every chapter. He illustrates prayer with reference to Old Testament characters, and the author's mind is at home using Jewish methods of thought and expression. We have his reference to the Jewish diaspora. We have the Lord of Sabaoth. We have Jewish formulae concerning oaths, and we have the major confession of the Jewish creed, the unity of God. The Lord our God is one Lord. So these are all pointing to his Jewish background. And then, of course, there's the similarities between Acts and James. If you take a look at Acts chapter 15, you'll see that there are parallels with the speech and the letter. And those parallels are indisputable. And I'm not going to detail where the contacts are, but you'll find them in the notes. There's definitely the contacts are there, particularly with James and Acts chapter 15. Then there are allusions to the teachings of Jesus as well. There are more parallels in this epistle than any other New Testament book to the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels, and many from the Sermon on the Mount. It's not a book that's written before the Christian era then at all, that idea. We should note the claim that here we find material that comes from the pre-literary synoptic tradition, so we're very early on in the first century, all pointing to early authorship. And then we can say that all these things in the rest of the New Testament, it agrees with the New Testament account of James. If you look at Acts 15 here, James appears to be the chief spokesman at the Jerusalem Council, and he's addressing the church with authority. Acts 15 and verse 13. And this is in full agreement with the tone of authority that the author of this epistle shows here in the book, and especially in the opening salutation. And then finally, the conditions within the community. The epistle appears to belong to the period before the fall of Jerusalem. It's suggested that the oppressors in chapter 5 were probably the wealthy landowners who, after the siege of Jerusalem, virtually ceased to exist in Judea. And so it points all to an early date, and it's in harmony with this view. It's in harmony with this view that the author was James, the Lord's brother. That's what everything is pointing to, as we can see here when we think about this matter of who was the author. You know, concerning this claim that a Jew, could not speak, especially a Galilean Jew, could not speak Greek fluently. Well, we can say now that the bilingual character of Galilee is well known, and no one can really hold to that position now. I mean, Martin, he actually refers particularly to one guy here called Rendell, the Epistle of James and Judaic Christianity. It's written in 1927. And he writes these words here, Rendell does: "It's time to discard the figment of Galilean illiteracy." He mentions various individuals: Philodemus, the philosopher. You've got Meleager, the epigrammist and anthologist, and then Theodorus, who was involved in rhetorical study. Josephus, the historian, were all, he says, of Galilee. So why can James not be writing an epistle like this if all these other men also were well known as coming from Galilee? So all these things are supporting the fact that we're thinking about James, the Lord's brother. I'll just quote a little bit what I've written here. While we have taken the time to outline the various discussions about James as author, there's nothing here that persuades us to forsake the traditional view. We're confident that this Galilean follower of his Lord is fully competent to compose this work. The bondslave of Jesus Christ is the one who can write this letter, the Epistle to James. So, if we think not only about who wrote it, but we want to think about when was it written. Well, conservative scholars are split into two groups here, two distinct positions regarding the dating of the epistle in the lifetime of James. You've got people like Tasker who consider that the work was written late in James's life, and we're thinking about 60 to 62 Christian era. We note that it was 62 that his martyrdom is mentioned at that time in Josephus. So we're talking about his death there. So before that, 60 to 62, that late date is supposed then to be indicated of because of the widespread and settled nature of the church, and the epistle is too little concerned with laying foundations, and distinctive doctrines are presupposed, and there's the presence in the community of the wealthy and the intellectual. Moral problems indicate a church whose first zeal has died, and 4:1 and 2:1 even, and the belief also in 2:14, as some see it, that the epistle argues against some kind of distorted form of Paulism. Those things are all pointing to a late date, but the arguments are not conclusive at all here for a late date. Others will choose a very early date for this epistle. People like Robison and Guthrie, an early date prior to the Jerusalem Council. They point to the primitive state of the church, the stage of the church's development in chapter 2 and 5:14, where it's actually called a synagogue, which is a relation to the assembly or the congregation, but synagogue. So we're talking here about the primitive stage of the church and its development. And there's the absence of any reference to the admission of Gentile converts and the Jewish character of the work. It's a very Jewish work, and you need to see why that was shortly. And then you look at the early, you could look also at the lack of early attestation of the epistle. It appears that the work was not widely known before the end of the 2nd century, but there are reasons for that, why it was not widely known. And I want to say something about that just now. You know, I'm expressing to you the view that we have to take account of its Jewish Christian readership circle. So we're talking about readership by Jewish Christians. Now, why is that? That could explain its obscurity and why it's not widely known before the end of the 2nd century. There's a kind of circulation of this letter within a contracting group of Jewish Christian churches. This group is small, and we have to see why that could be. So there's a Jewish Christian readership circle here. And then the fact that the epistle doesn't claim apostolic authority. Origen calls it scripture and draws from its content. That's after 200 Christian era. There's the comparison with the apostolic fathers indicates that James was probably earlier than any of them and may have been known by some of them. So we see that it's strange that the author did not claim to be the Lord's brother. Why did he not claim to be the Lord's brother? That would have added authority, but yet, other scholars will say it's more becoming what James wrote here. A bondslave, he's a bondslave of Jesus Christ, is more becoming of somebody who would be the brother of Christ when it comes to his human birth. So you can see it's a becoming way for him to refer to the Lord Jesus Christ and to himself as a bondslave. And the fact that an early date for the letter is also could be considered because of there's no mention of the great events of the Lord's life. James was certainly a witness to the resurrection, but he's not assuming they're familiar with the events as the author here, not assuming that people are just familiar already with these events, so he doesn't need to refer to them. And the purpose of the letter is more ethical than doctrinal. So you've got these pointers to the fact that it can be an early work, and that's quite important that we see that. Even when it comes to the conception of law in this epistle, well, some of course assume other things about James, that he was very much leaning towards the law, but in Acts chapter 15, he's a mediating personality. And in fact, he agrees with Paul's position and what Peter said at that time too, over against the legalists. And he's a leader in conciliatory action at that time. So all those things are very important. And so we can see that there's no question about the fact that it can be written earlier rather than later in the lifetime of James. What about this controversy with Paul and James, faith works debate and so on? Well, you've got to recognize here that if James depends on or refutes Galatians or Romans, if James, is refuting those, then the epistle has to be dated later, perhaps much later, to allow time for the circulation of Paul's works. So those works had to circulate, and then James is responding to them later. But, scholars today don't generally accept that James tries to refute Pauline perversions, later works of Paul here at all, because as David suggests, that not only does James fail to meet Paul's arguments, but he produces a work with which Paul would have agreed. Martin says here, both writers agree on the primacy of faith. Paul sets his face against any attempt to subvert God's gracious initiative by making works meritorious. Paul is always emphasizing that salvation is not by works, justification is by faith, not by works. But you see, James is simply arguing, this is complementary, he's simply arguing that living faith will complement itself by works. In other words, works will provide the evidence for real faith, not for some kind of orthodox belief that even the devils have, but faith has to be genuine, and that is seen in the actions, the responses of someone in works. And so there's no contradiction between these two authors at all, between Paul and James, but they complement one another. So we can affirm that the epistle can have been written early, even in the lifetime of James and in the history of the church. Who wrote it? When was it written? But then what can we say about its first readers? Who were its first readers? Well, if we're discussing a possible life setting for James, David's focuses on two groups of people in James 4 into 5-6, a mercantile group and an agricultural group. So you have these two groups which appear in the epistles. While Palestine was not the only land which this cultural data will fit, it does fit Palestine before 70 AD. It fits Palestine early. And you've got in James 5:7 as well, the summer and spring rains that are mentioned there are characteristic of the Palestinian climate, not the Egyptian climate or most of Asia Minor, but the Palestinian climate. So we're talking about the author being familiar with Palestine, and that should figure in our understanding of who its first readers are as well. So what can we say then? You've got these groups addressed here. It's to the 12 tribes and those that are scattered abroad of the diaspora. What are the possibilities with that? James is addressing who here as the first readers? The 12 tribes of the diaspora. Who's he talking to? Well, some, of course, will say it's Jews it's been spoken about here. But that term diaspora can be used also of Christians who are dispersed. We think of what you have in 1 Peter 1:1, where the letter was sent to the pilgrims of the dispersion. These are Christian churches scattered, in Bithynia and other locations. But these are Christian people, not just simply Jews. And we can say they're Christian Jews. Should we just be talking here about the Christian church generally as the new Israel? Well, that may be possible, but there's another view which is more in keeping, I think, with how we could think of those who were reading this letter. The third possibility is that the reference here is to certain Christian Jews. Certain Christian Jews. We've got a synagogue mentioned here, the meeting place. It's difficult to avoid the impression that these Christians have a Jewish background. The use of the Old Testament in the epistle we've talked about. And, this is what Davis has to say here. He would link the readers of this epistle, what we have in Acts chapter 8, verse 1 and verse 4, because there was a dispersion that took place there early in the lifetime of the church. Whenever through Paul's persecution, the church was scattered, there was dispersed throughout Palestine. In Acts 8, verse 1 and verse 4, there was a diaspora that was produced there. Now, in the light of later history, it'll always appear very, very limited, but no doubt it's there. There was a scattering from Jerusalem, Jewish Christians in the Jerusalem church, well known to James, of course, And here they're scattered now from Jerusalem throughout Palestine. And the fact is James not writing to this scattered congregation now, to these Christian Jews, and giving them the practical teaching that they need and how they ought to be living, doing the word, and not just reading it only, but doing it and manifesting the evidence of their faith in living works. So the suggestion is that we're talking about first readers as being those who were scattered from Jerusalem, well known to James, who now are being taught in this letter that James has sent. So who wrote James? It was the Lord's brother. And when was it written? Not late in his life, but probably early in his life. And then who were its first readers? Well, we're thinking about those people scattered in Acts chapter 8 are very important for this letter, and they can be the readership. Why was it written? Well, it's written, to give us some practical teaching about things that are pretty important. And I just want to mention a couple of things in the letter. You've got those verses that talk about being sure that we are doers of the word and not hearers only. That's so important in James chapter 1. And of course, you've got the earlier section about temptation. It's not God who tempts us, but it's the fallenness within, or the flesh within. And the answer is here in James chapter 4, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. There's strength and grace to be given in temptations are. In chapter 2, you can see how the wealthy landowners could be in view here because there were those who were promoting the wealthy in the congregation and pushing aside the poor, which ought not to happen. And then you have that passage where faith without works is dead, as I've said, was so important. It's not that salvation is by works, but works are the evidence of genuine faith. Thomas Manton, the Puritan, could write, faith alone saves, but the faith that saves is never alone. That faith has got to be shown, it's got to be seen. And that's what we're talking about here. It's got to be manifested. And of course, in chapter 2 here, that's why James can talk about Abraham being justified by works, and also Rahab justified by works. It's just that their works give expression, manifested the faith which they had. It was their faith that was foundational to them and their salvation, but it was seen in the life that they lived and the actions that they performed. All that is there. And then, of course, there's the matter of the tongue in chapter 3, which is so important. And the tongue has to be controlled. The Lord has to control our tongues. The need to seek God for wisdom. And then we have, of course, the fact that friendship with the world is enmity with God. And we have the whole section about the fact that we should not be planning without God. We're talking about businessmen traveling and these rich landowners who are making decisions, and today and tomorrow we'll go into such and such a city, chapter 4:13, and spend a year there and buy and sell and get gain, make a profit and so on. But they don't know what's going to happen in the morrow. It's if the Lord wills, it will happen. They had to seek the guidance of God and plan with God and alone with God in the decisions they were making and taking at that time. And then, of course, you've got the rich landowners in chapter 5 then, who were mistreating their poor labourers. These people who were actually withholding the wages of their labourers, who mowed their fields and kept back their wages by fraud. Those things were crying out, and the fact is that he does say here, you've condemned, you've murdered the just. That's the just one He doesn't resist you. There was no resistance by these poor Christians, but they were being mistreated. It all fits in so clearly with what we have been thinking about concerning those scattered from Jerusalem. And finally, then we have the backsliders that can be restored at the end of chapter 5 as well. All those are very important as we think about why it was written, the purpose, why we have this letter here, no doubt about that. Can I just say then, as we come in closing, just again to emphasize about James being the author here, you know, Martin has made some statements which I know many will perhaps look at seriously and accept, but we have to seriously think about them and question whether he's got it right here, because he talks about those who perhaps, you know, have moved from Jerusalem. And so we were talking about those in Antioch and Syria, and he's talking about the deposit of James' teaching. Just the deposit of his teaching has been carried there by his disciples. And finally, an enterprising editor has polished up all the material in the presence of the Hellenistic idioms and puts it in an epistolary form and makes it a credible letter, an apostolic letter. But do we need James' teaching to be carried anywhere? Do we need an enterprising editor to polish it up? And I want to comment here, and as I close, with other commentators, we do not need to find here some kind of two-layered work addressing the local situation, drawing on James' testamentary legacy in defense of the Jerusalem pious poor of an earlier time. Rather, we can have confidence in James, the Lord's brother, his competence, and recognize his role as a preeminent teacher already in the church. He's competent to speak into this situation, to bring authoritative and practical teaching required for both the rich and for the poor, for those who ought to be manifesting faith works instead of dead orthodoxy. Oh yes, there were those that were scattered from Jerusalem, but they only had a dead orthodoxy. Well, the devil, we're told, believes and trembles. Faith has to be real. Faith has to be seen in a changed life, in faith works. And that's what James emphasizes here when it comes to the Christian community. What a letter. What a wonderful author. James, the Lord's brother, a bondslave of Jesus Christ. So much to teach us. Take time to read it carefully. Thank you.